Good morning. Welcome to Struggles of the Spirit. I'm your host and director of the program, the Reverend Leland Udell, and I'm delighted you have tuned in to us today. You may be a regular viewer, and in which case, thank you for your earnest following of our program and of what we've been trying to do here. The subject today is one about what is it in this unholy world that where in two different religious traditions where one might find holiness. How do you go about finding holiness in an unholy world? And we have two guests to speak to that. Rabbi James Glazier from Temple Sinai and Dr. Ed Mahoney, Associate Dean at St. Michael's College. They're going to talk about this subject. But before we begin, and our technician Karen doesn't know this, it was suggested by Rabbi Jim Glazier to invite the public to call us anytime during this next hour. I don't know if is that possible, Karen. Hopefully you can manage that. We will still invite you, especially at 12:15, to phone in. But as we go along in our conversation, you're welcome to call us. We're going to try a little different approach today. And so if you would like, Karen will put the phone number up on the TV screen, and you will see what the phone-in number is. So if something we say speaks to you and you'd like to let us know how it influenced you and moved you, please call us and let us know. So you can call anytime, and then also especially so the last 15 minutes from 12:15 to 12:30. So welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Glad to have you here, and thank you for your idea, Jim, to invite our viewers to call in at any moment.
Yeah.
Who would like to begin talking about how one, as an individual or one in an institution, a religious institution, how do you find holiness in a world that is not very holy?
Rabbi?
Thank you, Ed. It depends upon how you come to see the world initially, whether you see it as a holy manifestation or an unholy manifestation. I think in my tradition we'd like to think of the world as a holy place, capable of being redeemed, that it is not in itself an unholy place. That which is unholy tends to be those acts or behaviors committed by humankind to make that which is holy unholy. Now, we could say, for example, that there are natural states of being. Disease, for example, is neither holy nor unholy, but our response to disease could be holy or unholy as human beings. So I don't want the public to think that we live in an unholy place, that the environment in which we're living is by its very nature an unpleasant or an unholy place to be.
Creation isn't necessarily by the fact of it being a created universe. It isn't bad.
Right. Its essence, is, as a matter of fact, is good. At least I come to see it as a good place to be living, following the language of Genesis. And God saw all that had been made, and God called it good or very good.
Now, would you share with the public what I have heard you say before, and I've heard other rabbis say, because Christians have had a different understanding than Jews, it appears to me, about Satan, about the serpent, and because that sort of sets up a kind of a dualism for some Christians, almost, not exact, but almost. But for a Jew, it's a completely different meaning, I understand.
Well, Satan does exist in our theology, but Satan comes across as being an angel of God, part of the heavenly hosts, and he tends to be, or she tends to be, we don't know the gender of this angel, tends to be a prosecuting attorney, the prosecutor. So when a person's behavior is challenged, it tends to be this prosecuting attorney that is going on a mission to determine whether any kind of evil exists within a particular personage. Example, I was just reading the book of Job. God is highlighting the life of Job, what an admirable person Job is, and then Satan comes along and says, but if I test him, will he prove to be faithful to you? And God, giving permission to this prosecuting attorney, then allows Job to really take quite a painful path for Job, to test his spirit, to test his resolve. We see that again in Jewish literature, particularly rabbinic literature, with respect to the whole test of Abraham vis-a-vis Isaac. The sacrifice of Isaac isn't so much about sacrificing a boy as it is the test of Abraham by this prosecuting attorney. What has Abraham done for you lately is the kind of prosecutory method that this Satan is presenting to God. So God says, okay, you don't think he's worthy, I think he's worthy, go test him. And so the test of the sacrifice is really an attempt to satisfy the interest of this angel, Satan.
Interesting way to think of Satan as a prosecuting attorney. But just in sort of summation, then unlike some Christians, you don't see Satan in the fall, Adam and Eve's fall. You don't see all of creation sort of blasted with evil, filled with corruption.
We see it as a metaphor for human existence.
Okay.
And that what befell Adam and Eve only describes human condition. And imagine, if you will, if life was Eden. It's how we perceive heaven. But imagine our day-to-day life. If it were always so easy, what would be the challenges we face as human beings to bring about a partnership with God in terms of improving the quality of life here on earth? So for us, it's really an allegory or a way of defining our own human existence.
And if I can put you on the spot,
Sure.
A friend of mine said the present Pope has come out more or less saying what Jim just said about the place of Satan. Do you know something about this? Can you inform our viewers about that?
Well, I think maybe I would start out by saying that I very much agree with Rabbi Glazier on this point about creation, as creation is, all created realities are good. And I can only speak really from a contemporary Catholic point of view. I cannot speak for Baptists and evangelicals and Methodists.
No, I'm not asking you to.
I know that, but I just, so I think when we're talking about a Jewish perspective or a Christian perspective,
Roman Catholic perspective.
I can talk about a contemporary Roman Catholic perspective.
Fine.
And I think that what we would say is very much in line with what the rabbi has just said, that creation is seen as basically good, and that the story of Genesis need not be taken literally as creation happened in this way over this period of time as it's described in the book of Genesis, but that it is a metaphor, and that the metaphor is that God's desire is reconciliation and harmony of all created realities, that there is a desire on the part of God for humans to be in harmony and reconciled with one another. There is a desire on the part of God that humans be in harmony with all of creation, the whole cosmos. There is a desire that humans, on the part of God, that humans be in harmony and reconciled with God. And there is a desire that humans be reconciled and in harmony with themselves, so that their heart their heart feels whole and they feel like an integral person. Now, we all realize that there are many different ways in which, as individuals and as communities and as a global society, we fail in many respects to experience that harmony. Sometimes it is due to our own making as individuals, and more now as cultures and societies and human institutions and entities that cause these failures and disharmony and dis-ease. But there's also those other natural sorts of happenings, disease, illness, earthquakes, that are devastating, and in a sense we could say they are evil, not in a personal way, but they're evil because they are not good. But no one is to blame for them necessarily, because there are earthquakes. That's part of the natural processes of the created realities in which we live. And so some might say, well, if God created everything as good, why would these sorts of things happen? And why doesn't God intervene? And maybe that's another question. But in sum, I think that we're very much in agreement with what Rabbi Glazier has just said.
Isn't there something the Pope just said along this line? Somebody told me about it.
Well, in recent years, certainly John Paul II has spoken very clearly in his audiences and his encyclicals and in other places about the sort of the interpretation of the Bible and the use of the Bible, for example, and the stories of the Bible, and that comes in line certainly with historical biblical criticism that the Church has accepted certainly for a long time, at least within this century anyway.
Okay. So this is sort of background material to our theme that we're looking at today. So the fact that we experience an unholy world sometimes is not because creation is tainted, because as people sometimes have said, it was a young God who was experimenting with creation and didn't do a good job, and we have to bear the evil results of that. That's not the case. We're saying here that creation is not tainted. It isn't evil in and of itself. So where does the evil come from that we find in our lives? Maybe that's not the right word, but the unhappiness that we experience. Where is it? Where does it come from?
Evil, like good, is an absolute. I mean, it exists. It exists because of poor decision-making by individuals. It exists because the self supersedes the community. It exists because we grow insensitive to the needs of others. So it exists. I think in the book of Genesis, the story of Cain and Abel, sin croucheth at the door, don't let it in. So it's out there. It's a question of picking and choosing correctly. Some people are so into their own need that they can't experience the need or the hardship of others. Kind of, I want to make it to the red light first mentality. If I run over 3 people doing it, I still got to the red light. Isn't that what's important? So it's a matter of seeing yourself within context and how you see yourself within the context of community, within relationship to God. Our shared tradition says that we are a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. I wonder how many people internalize that and see themselves as a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. in the decision making, in the day-to-day activities of their lives. So often people speak about wanting to do good, but wanting to do good is not the same as being mandated to do good. And we have a mandate to do good.
I would agree with that. One of the concerns that I have is not just certainly, and I know you do as well, is not just the individual decisions that we make, but more and more the collective decisions that are made by governing bodies, and whether those entities be a city council or a state legislature or the federal government, or more and more whether those entities be the global enterprises of the multinational corporations that affect very much, sometimes even more so, the lives of people than decisions by governments. And it seems to me that every decision that we make as individuals or that corporate entities make are made because of a perceived good. And the perceived good, I don't think any of us, whether we're corporate or individual, go out choosing things that we think are, that's going to harm me. But we look for things that, from our own perspective, are going to be helpful for us in some way. And I think, as Rabbi Glazier was just saying, that what we don't take sufficient count of is the needs and the goods of other persons, other individuals and other societies and other groups in such a way as that affects the kinds of decisions that we make. One of the things that the Catholic Church has, particularly over the last 30 years, coming out of Latin America, has talked about is option for the poor, and John Paul II himself has often spoken of the option for the poor, particularly as he's traveled around the globe to various places, and particularly those countries that are experiencing such oppression and poverty. Basically, I think that means that when we are making decisions as communities, as individuals, as societies, that the first question we ask is, how is this going to affect those who are least advantaged? How is this decision going to lift up and serve the well-being of those who are least served? I think that is the question that should be on everybody's front burner, if you want, but it's not. And it seems to me that the challenge of living a holy life is precisely for those of us who are wanting to do that, to in a way be prophets and to speak of the need for the community at large. So I'm as much concerned about the larger social questions as I am about individuals, and I know Rabbi Glazier is as well.
My old seminary professor, Reinhold Niebuhr, emphasized very strongly corporate involvement here.
It's very difficult, however, to establish a sense of sacredness, holiness, when you feel isolated in society. If you feel like your society is deteriorating, how do you then become actively involved in repairing the society in which you live, to raise the level of ethic, of morality, of behavior? Very difficult. And people become disheartened. The values that you were referring to clearly are often undercut, undermined by what I call secular value systems. And we're bombarded by secular value systems. It's not a question of whether we want to do good or improve our lot and the lot of others. It often becomes, how do I just remove the burden, the weight of a society that just pushes and pushes envelopes, even though we know that the behavior is inappropriate, what children are being exposed to, what adults are being exposed to. Many people talk about the violence on TV. I'm worried about a lot of other issues that happen to take place on TV as well. And then these values get communicated to our children, who then perpetuate it in our streets and in our schools and in our homes. I find myself worrying about the level of respect that individuals have for what I consider lofty positions. And I'm not suggesting that I hold a lofty position, but the way people address police officers and the way they address teachers and librarians and people of renown, and it's almost as if we've accentuated base and devalued respect. It's a big concern of mine.
And comment about that, I for various reasons, I've been involved with the courts a little bit in recent years, and there's where there's a certain respect, and that still takes place. You're told when the judge enters, we all stand. I mean, there's no question about, I want to sit. You all stand, and when the gavel comes down, that's it. I mean, there are certain rules there that that are sort of foreign to ordinary daily life. Even in the church, they're foreign or maybe foreign in the synagogue as well. I mean, Jews never got divorced, in my experience, when I was growing up. And that's changed. I'm not wanting to talk about the pros and cons. I'm just saying that of divorce. I'm just saying that things were a bit more in the past. That there were high standards and very strict requirements.
Hillel made a statement. Rabbi Hillel, who goes back before the millennium, the first millennium. He said, "In a community where no one acts human, you must be a human being." So almost, it doesn't matter what your neighbor is doing. It doesn't matter whether you're a voice in the wilderness. You must speak. You must act as a human being. So it's easy to opt out, but that in itself isn't sufficient. You have to continue on, even though you're not necessarily mandated by the society at large to do so.
And I think that from my experience over the years, that desire is not an isolated desire. I think often people sense that they are isolated, but I have been in various positions to be able to talk with people and to hear individuals, and I'm sure you have in your pastoral work, to hear individuals talk about their sense of isolation, but in a week's time you may hear 10 individuals and you'll say, well, let's connect those people with one another, and it seems to me that the work of the church, the work of the synagogues is in some ways to connect people with one another, because I do think that there are many more people around who are experiencing the same kinds of pressures and the same kinds of desires to move out of that in a way that really serves them and serves other people well. But there is this sense of isolation that they feel, and I think that putting them in connection with one another is an important thing for us to do.
How do you tell the people in your congregation about these things? What I'm trying to say here is secular values are so powerful. They're so almost omnipresent, and they speak so loudly. How do we in the synagogue, or we in the church, how do we educate our people? Because so often our people are confused. They don't know what is the religious spiritual standard and what is the faith of the secular world.
Well, having a pulpit helps. You can address issues, current issues from the pulpit. What I enjoy as well is I'm not the first rabbi to ever walk the face of the earth. And there's a plethora of rabbinic material. My congregation very much enjoys the give and take of the legalisms that go into rabbinic decision making. For example, let's suppose that someone wanted to do something specific. Let's say that they wanted to rent the synagogue to have a private bar mitzvah, and only their chosen guests would be allowed to attend. Now, I could, off the top of my head, say, no, that's not in keeping with Jewish tradition. But to give much more weight, I could use what we call responsa, decisions made by other rabbis that dealt with either the exact same question or a similar question. Then when I go in and I say, well, the weight of our society says that privatization of religious events is not wrong, but I'm here to tell you rabbinically, as well as having centuries of tradition backing me up, that it is wrong. And I think we have to base our synagogue on tradition, not on contemporary values. That at least helps. So the pulpit or an educational opportunity in a meeting, these can give me some ability to provide insight, at least from a religious point of view.
I think from certainly from working with young people in a college setting, that there's tremendous opportunities there for discussion of values, and for students to have opportunities to really put their values into practice in lots of different ways. So certainly within the context of the classroom, those sorts of issues will come up, and it's not just sort of in an ethics class that this would happen, but those issues are raised across the board, and whether they're questions of academic integrity and students' temptations to plagiarize or cheat, that the students come from a culture where fudging on a resume or not telling the truth, it seems to be part and parcel often of daily activities, not just of young people and necessarily, but of adults.
Right.
And certainly surveys indicate that when people are pretty honest about how often they've fudged on their taxes, or how often
Pay me cash, not a check.
Yeah.
Please.
Well, so that I think that we receive young people from that kind of milieu, and to suggest that a college or university then is somehow supposed to change that is demanding a bit much. However, what we can do is work with, I think, the good instincts of good people, and encourage them to think and to be more reflective about the values that they hold dear, and those that may be in conflict with what the larger culture is saying, and give them opportunities to be in service. We have probably at St. Michael's, and it's not unusual now at colleges and universities, but at St. Michael's, probably 80% of every graduating class, 80% of those students have in some way been in service. They may have done a service trip to Alabama or to New York City at Covenant House, or they may have been involved for 4 years with a Big Brother, Big Sister organization, but they have done something. And we probably have 500 students, 400 to 500 students every year who are involved in those sorts of things. Well, so that makes an impact on students' life. And so what we are really trying to do is, both in an academic setting and in a critical, reflective way, but also in a way that involves students in their own experience, to take those values and to put them into practice, both in terms of how they think about things as well as in terms of what they do. I guess that maybe today is a day of optimism for me, but I think there's some days I can be more optimistic than other days, but generally I think the tradition that I come from is an optimistic tradition, that the Catholic tradition is one of optimism, that we are ultimately moving toward God, and that we are drawn toward God, that we are basically good. We as individuals and as societies don't make the right choices sometimes, but that there is within us, within each one of us, the potential for doing good. And it seems to me that what we need to do is continue to challenge ourselves, challenge one another, challenge our congregations, our students, to live up to that potential. There are other days when I don't quite maybe see that quite as much, but generally I think that that's the tradition I come from. And
Which side of the bed you get out of.
Yeah, but I think I sense that that's also where you are.
It does me little good to focus on the negativity of life. I mean, after we've established that we live in a difficult time, then you have to say, well, what do we do with that? Because if you dwell on the negative, if you have a pessimistic view, as the professor indicates, what are you going to do with that? There's nothing left but to concede and give up. I do want to touch on something that you said, Ed, and that has to do with, obviously St. Michael's is a Catholic school. It's a church-based school. And while we differ in terms of our theologies, obviously, a message that I keep on repeating to myself, at least of late, is that we've gone through a period of I will decide what constitutes right and ethic in my life. I will be the master of my own theology, if you will. Almost this radical, nonconformist, anti-institutionalized form of individualized religion, which is all well and good until it tries to perpetuate itself or standardize itself. So we get into moral relativism.
Right.
I think, now I may be promoting my own agenda, but I think we're getting beyond that individualized sense of morality. I will determine what's right, inasmuch as it doesn't often demand very much of the individual. I think people often forget that religion is rigorous, that it's much easier to acquiesce and to find the lowest common denominator for behavior. And I'd like to think that people who are becoming part of community understand that to be a part of a community is more than just if my own needs are satisfied, but what can I do as an individual to that greater storehouse of good? How do I become a meaningful resource in the world? Because very much, if you would ask an individual previously, they might say, well, it doesn't conform to what I think I need to do or how I perceive the world should function. And that's all well and good, but often it takes a greater number of people to make something happen than the individual. And that's the struggle we have, by the way, when we think of our society, holy or unholy. In the West, we so focused on the rights of the individual that supersede the rights of the community. And often it's very humbling, it's very difficult to take yourself out of the me, myself, and I and think of the we, ourselves, and community.
Yeah, and that is an area where I would agree that there's some change taking place, but we are so focused on the rights of the individual and autonomy that we can easily forget the needs of the community. And if everybody is focusing on their own rights, then there's tremendous conflict. But the need to think of the larger common good is terribly important, and that's one of the things that we really try with the students, and we can do that more because we are a small residential college. We can do that, I hope, a bit better than other places which are larger and non-residential based, that we can do a lot of work with the students outside the classroom, in the dormitories, and in student activities too. And we do really stress the notion of responsibility, not just to themselves, but responsibility to the community, to the other students in the dorm, to other students in their classes. And I think, as I have been at St. Michael's for 15 years now, and have seen students come through, I do think that there is a turning that is willing to look at those issues a bit more I don't want to say seriously, but to engage in those questions of community and to see the importance of that more, I think, than maybe 10 or 15 years ago. but we still struggle against a society that so strongly stresses autonomy and individualism and self-determination, all of which are good and necessary, but they need to be in balance. Right.
Yeah, I've recently been reading a book called Conversations with God. Maybe it's been out for a couple of years.
Oh, yes.
And the writer says that the religious organizations have created the agnosticism, basically because they have been pushing so much their revelatory inside picture of God and what God wants for us, that they ignore what is the personal experience of the individual, and they don't try to help that personal experience be understood, developed, and maybe strengthened by what the synagogue or the church says, but they just sort of say, no, let's get down to what the real revelation is. We have it all here, and what you have is invalid.
Agree, but to a certain extent, I can't conform to that thinking, because quite often it's only through participation in group activity that you sense that spirituality that is often lost in the individual pursuit of God. That is not to say that one can't be spiritual or connected to God or whatever those words mean alone. But quite often what I see as a transforming activity is something that happens within the life of a family or community, in shared prayer or in shared activity, that lifts the individual. What I think often is misworded is that people often feel a spiritual moment and yet don't know how to describe that moment because they're afraid to ascribe it as a God moment or a spiritual moment. Right. So that they'll have an uplifting experience, maybe they'll call it spiritual, but many will just say this was fun and not understand that that was the original intent of the activity to begin with. It's the experiential, and through that experiential you have a God moment, if you will.
And I would also take issue with conversations with God, because I think what the author is doing is sort of talking about his own experiences with God, and all of that is fine, but if that's all that one has in terms of the God experience, if you will, then it misses out or misses completely, I think, what, at least from my understanding, is the larger tradition of that we come out of, and the larger tradition of the religious experiences of people. I think that the key really is, as Rabbi Glazier was saying, the key, I think, is to be attentive to our own experiences, whether there are experiences of ourselves, but particularly experiences with other people in the context of other people. Parker Palmer, who is a wonderful educator and has written a lot about the process of education, talks about transforming experience in the classroom, transformative experience, and really talks about those as spiritual moments. But I think any one of us, as a teacher in a classroom or as a preaching from a pulpit, can feel a certain high because of the resonance that's going on. But if we only say, oh gee, that was neat, it doesn't go anywhere. But if we can also reflect and say, that may be a real spiritual moment, and that may be a real deep moment of possible transformation for myself as well as the people with whom I'm engaged. And it's that challenge that I think we're called to meet, to be attentive always to what's going on within ourselves and outside of ourselves, so that the holy God may enter in. Because I mean, we're maybe coming back more specifically to the topic, but it's not that God doesn't want to be there, at least from my perspective. God very much desires to be with us. It's the question of, are we attentive to the God who wants to be with us? And I think that God can be with us in any experience that we have as individuals, as a collectivity. Those social experiences, God can be present to us in the dream world. I think that we read stories in the Bible where people hear things or experience God in a dream.
Sure.
And we say, oh, well, those are holy people. No, they're no different than we are. It's just that what they did was listen to the dream.
That's right.
And we don't in that kind of way as a possible inbreaking of God.
Yeah, well, having worked in, as you know, both of you, most of my life in hospitals and been very close to people in very critical times in their life, a lot of people have experiences with God, but they are often afraid to tell anyone, to tell their spouse, to tell their pastor, their rabbi. They feel they'll be laughed at, or they'll be told, "Oh, you've had too much medication," or there's something of a put down, you know.
Yeah. But what's interesting?
It's very sad.
Yeah. No, what's interesting, I think, though, is what's happening in lots of different fields, in the field of education, the field of business, the field of healthcare and medicine, is the people are raising the question of spirituality, that we have just, by virtue of a very generous grant for a 3-year period, been able to establish a project or program on spirituality and education at St. Michael's, and that part of that is to help faculty and staff reflect more openly and together on their own spiritual journeys and how that impacts our lives in the classroom or as we're dealing with one another and with students. It also is, the part of the grant also allows us to begin to work with teachers in grade schools and high schools who are terribly interested in the questions of spirituality, but don't quite know how to raise that, how to talk about that, how to deal with that, because they see the students asking those sorts of questions as well. But what do you say, and how do you get at that? I think that's also true in business. Business Week magazine this past week, the headline or the front cover story was spirituality in business. The healthcare profession, I think, is also looking at that much more seriously in terms of what effects spirituality has on healing. So maybe it's another reason to be somewhat optimistic about, because I think people are experiencing a need and they're saying that need is not being met, and they're looking and searching, and I think it's a prime moment for church people to really respond in creative and new sorts of ways to those desires and those yearnings that people have now, that people have always had.
So we're really back to our theme. How do you find holiness in a world that is not always full of spiritual values?
Well, I mean, I think people are experiencing that need and desire and articulating that.
I don't think the need ever goes away.
No.
I think that we perceive that we're becoming more spiritual, but in fact, spirituality, or the search for spirituality, is not something that comes and goes decade from decade. I was thinking, as Dr. Mahoney was speaking, about the way we worship God in Judaism. You can worship God through worship itself. You can worship God through learning, because learning can be a spiritual opportunity, growth, and you worship God through acts of loving kindness. So when you combine those activities, by the way, worship, study, acts of loving kindness, constituted an entire day of a person's life. So what essentially is being said is every moment of every day you can be engaged in worship. Now, for most people, theologic language has been usurped. So God words, worship words, faith words. For the lay person, all of these, they know they're searching for something, but the very terminologies we use can turn people off, because it becomes what they perceive religion to be, not what religion happens to be. And that's a whole different area before we can even begin to engage people. At synagogue, for example, one of the most spiritual opportunities is for a parent to see his or her child celebrate a bar or bat mitzvah. And they'll come up afterward and say, this was so meaningful to me. They won't use the word spiritual necessarily, but they'll say, this was so meaningful to me. And I said, well, you've had a very spiritual opportunity. This is a wonderful opportunity within the context of faith. And they begin to understand the correlation between family, dedication, congregational involvement. It starts to meld. Now, obviously, there are other ways to do that kind of a transforming experience. Learning in a college, committing yourselves to good work, charitable work. There are many avenues. But it could be, as Professor Mahoney said earlier, it could be as easy as simply smiling at a customer when you make them change.
Absolutely.
And it's lost in our society because we don't think of every moment of every day as being an opportunity to interact in a holy way, and through that behavior we bring God to that very instance, that experience. And so people see their religious lives as, I go to church or I go to synagogue and I'm religious.
There,
in
that building.
In that context. And yet when I leave that context, if I've said my prayers right, if I've did my appropriate number of confessions or beatitudes, or in Judaism the number of prayers that I need to say, when I leave there, it's over. It isn't over. It ain't over at all. It's just beginning. That's a renewal place. It's a rebirthing place. But when you go off into the world, then you take what you've learned from that place, what you've experienced, the holiness that hopefully you were able to achieve, and see how you can integrate that into the rest of your life. But people have segmented or compartmentalized their lives to such an extent that they don't see one realm in any way involving the other.
It's really wonderful to have this conversation because there are so many convergences. Two that come immediately to mind when you're talking about holiness of life in terms of the intellect and acts of charity and etc. That I'm just thinking of Thomas Aquinas in the Middle Ages. For Thomas, the eros of the mind, or searching for truth and knowledge, was a spiritual activity, and we don't think of it that way. And then, so I would say, well, what is the challenge to us in terms of our search for knowledge, or the kinds of things we pursue in terms of our reading and study? Do we see that as a spiritual activity?
But there used to be a phrase when I was growing up. I don't know if it's exclusive to Jewish homes, but I suggest not. Learning for learning's sake. It didn't matter what you were learning. It just meant that you were learning. And I can remember picking up books, and they seemed so unconnected, and I would say, I'm not really interested, and my mother would say, read it anyway, you might learn something from it. That was her response. You might learn something from it. And today, I mean, part of the issue had been the whole economics of going to college, that if you couldn't justify the cost, why were you going? And if you did go, how did you justify the cost? By focusing on a very specific area so that you could go conquer the world in that specific area and make a life for yourself. No question about it. But it was always something of an anathema to me, who went to a liberal arts school, that learning for learning's sake is a wonderful opportunity. And so people now, if I don't have to learn it, why should I learn it? Well, why not learn it? What's the matter with learning a new language or a new culture or history or whatever it might be, just for the enlightenment of learning?
It's a humanizing experience.
Very much.
And the more we are humanized, then the greater potential we have for humanizing the world and making the world a holier place. Just also briefly, another area of convergence is when you were talking about worship. And certainly in the Catholic tradition, Eucharist for us is the center, as it is for a number of other Christian traditions. But Eucharist is the center, but it's the high point of celebrating who we are as a people. At the same time, what it is meant to do is bring together all our efforts that we've made prior to coming to Eucharist at being God's Word for other people. And whether that's simply a smile, or whether that's through teaching, or whatever it is, that we have brought that word, that message to others. It's also a time for us to bring together and to remember the fact that we have worked together as a community, and then not just here, but we've tended to one another in other places. It's also a time for us to come together and to remember that we have committed ourselves to justice. And then it's also a time for us to, to come together and to celebrate. But Eucharist, if it's done well, is meant to bring together all of those things in this place, to highlight them, and then to mission people back to continue doing it. And so, I mean, when you talk about worship in the Jewish tradition, there's that convergence in terms of, ideally, at least what we think of Eucharist, it's very much the same.
I need to pause for a moment here, because it's a time for our viewers to phone in. We've been waiting your call all along since we began at 11:30, but you haven't phoned us, so now is the opportunity from now until 12:30 when the program is over. We really want your call. Karen, please put up on the screen the phone number to phone in here at Channel 15. And we will hear your voice, and the public will hear your voice through the loudspeaker here in the studio, and we'll respond, and we'll make you a part of our group here. So we would like you to call because we want to be sure we're reaching you in some way, that your wheels are turning as our wheels turn. We need your input. So please call us. We've been talking here with Rabbi James Glazier from Temple Sinai in South Burlington, and with Dr. Edward Mahoney from St. Michael's College. We're talking about the subject, how do you find holiness in a world that often doesn't seem to be interested in holiness? As we're
waiting for calls, I'll fill in the silence a bit. But I've known Rabbi Glazier for some time, and we have opportunities once in a while to have some conversations, but this for me has just been a wonderful opportunity to have a more extended conversation. And it occurs to me that a couple of things, at least. One, that this is a holy moment. If we want, that this is a holy moment, and if you want to call it an unholy world, I don't think we're in an unholy world. There are unholy things that go on. But it is a holy moment, and I lament the fact that we don't have as many opportunities to do this sort of thing. And what perhaps we need to do is to encourage one another and encourage people who are listening to engage in these kinds of holy moments with other people who are coming from other traditions, who are and want to engage in this kind of conversation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I too found it an enlightening experience, and one which I think, as far as our own community, I think there needs to be more opportunity for these kinds of sharing moments.
Well, you used to have a resident rabbi at St. Michael's, Rabbi Max Wall.
That's true.
Well,
has anyone taken his place?
Yes, Rabbi Chasen is continuing to teach.
Yes.
He teaches
his course.
On
really
Judaism
good.
every fall.
Great.
Right.
Good.
Yeah. And we still have a very close association, of course, with Rabbi Wall and with the Rabbi Wall lecture series and other kinds of efforts. So.
5 minutes.
Good. Professor Mahoney and I served with him on the investigational review board of the hospital, where protocols involving human subjects were studied for their appropriateness, both scientifically and in terms of their humaneness. So we've had discussions, but always within the context of study protocols. That too is an interesting area in which trying to be scientifically astute, but at the same time maintaining the sacredness of human life, is a very great challenge, a very great challenge.
I was on that committee also for a number of years, and at that time, I don't know if it's still that way, at that time we respected each other's opinion so much that if anyone did not want to approve a scientific protocol, the committee would not approve it. We arbitrarily said we have to be unanimous. It wasn't like, 3/5. It had to be unanimous.
Wow, I don't think they maintain that any longer, do they?
No. Generally speaking, that there is consensus though on the protocols of whether they move forward or whether they would be tabled. Once in a while, I think there may be a vote where there's one or two dissenting.
You're still on the committee?
I am, yeah. But what I've been very much impressed by the people on the committee in terms of not only their scientific and medical capabilities, but also their very, very careful reflection on what it is that we're about in terms of protecting human subjects and the sacredness of life. And I'm very, very impressed by that group.
So in terms of today's theme, the committee still tries to not violate the holiness
right.
of
Absolutely.
people.
Absolutely.
It's an odd time we live in some respects. We have the casualness of individuals who take human life, the shootings in schools, the random acts of violence, and at the very same time we have people who are sitting in committee rooms discussing protocols which hopefully will improve the quality and longevity of life. It is a most remarkable time to think that we can be living in such an age where on one hand people are taking each other's lives and on the other hand people are vigorously working to save human life.
I suppose, though, and I'm not a historian, but I would imagine in the history of the world, something like that has always been going on in terms of the tension between people who are responsible for their brothers and sisters, or trying to anyway be responsible and creative and healing, and those who are contemptuous of people's needs.
The toys are bigger, though.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah.
The guns are more
Much
damaging, and
more
the
powerful.
medical advancements are more miraculous. Yeah.
So it is possible to live a holy life, even though society may have elements in it that make it difficult.
I think living a holy life is living wholeness of life.
Okay.
Yeah.
We've been talking here today about this subject with Rabbi James Glazier from Temple Sinai and Associate Dean at St. Michael's College, Dr. Ed Mahoney. And I hope you've enjoyed the program, and you'll write us if you have some further thoughts. We can pass your reaction around to our speakers. So thank you again.